Hi. So today we come to something which might appear as very mundane, as so matter of fact that we might not even think to question it or to reflect on it, which is precisely the reason Lefebvre said that this is something that we need to look at. Lefebvre is a Marxist scholar. He's also a humanist and much later in the timeline. So what we are going to do this week is look at scholars who've explicitly engaged with the idea of space and also time. And he's the first in that series that I'm going to talk about. We'll look at David Harvey, we'll look at Doreen Massey, but first two lectures we'll do on Henri Lefebvre, who's a French philosopher, sociologist, political economist, and humanist, and both very active in terms of scholarship and theory, but also in terms of his activism and his political engagements. He was a very central member of the French Communist Party, but eventually got expelled from there because he did not kind of subscribe to the more didactic Marxism, especially the kind that was deterministic in the economic sense, because he really felt and believed from his own experience and observations that it is not just the factory floor, but everyday life that needs to be critiqued and changed, because it's where capitalism is actually creating structures that bind us or alienate us, but it is also the space from which transformation can begin. Now, the book that I am going to largely speak about, actually it's not one book, even though it's largely one idea, at least in the title, and that is the idea of everyday life. He wrote 3 volumes of everyday life, and his last book, which was posthumously published, called Rhythm Analysis, was also meant as the 4th volume of the critique of everyday life. And he publishes the first one in the late 1940s, the second one in the early 1960s, and then the third one 20 years hence, and then the 4th Rhythm Analysis in the 1990s. So let's take a look at what Lefebvre is trying to do and how his ideas develop as he moves from the critique of everyday life, the first one he titles mainly subtitles Introduction, to the critique of everyday life. In the second one he subtitles Foundations for a Sociology of the Everyday, and then the third one is From Modernity to Modernism, where he says how modernism becomes the realm of a managed, administered, bureaucratic, controlled everyday. All right, so with that, let's begin. These are some of Lefebvre's writings. Like I said, in 1947, he writes The Critique of Everyday Life, Introduction. Lefebvre was born in 1901, and he lived a long life and he wrote a lot. And he saw the 2 world wars, and he saw the movement from more rural societies. He was born in a rural part of southern France, to when in the post-World War, Second World War especially, Reconstruction period, the welfare state, mass housing, planning and architecture, and how they take control over space and time and managed routines. So all of that he's reflecting on in his first volume, Critique of Everyday Life. The second one intensifies it. Bureaucracy is intensified. This is where you can kind of get an inkling of what Weber is perhaps talking about also. And then 1968, a very, very important period in the history of the world and in the history of France, when student riots broke out. A student movement was started in May 1968 that questioned authority, that questioned domination and control over space and students' routines. This was a movement joined by students, the working classes, and several other urban inhabitants. Lefebvre was a professor in the college at that time, at the university at the time, and therefore many of his students were also central to the revolution. And so one can say that he is both somebody who the students are inspired by, and then he also uses that moment literally moment. You will see as we move on in the lecture why I'm stressing on the moment here, to reflect upon how everyday life is a site of struggle, and that's what actually needs to be transformed. These 4 books, The Right to the City, Towards an Architecture of Enjoyment, Urban Revolution and Production of Space, these 4 books largely speak to the urban space, and I will talk about them in my next lecture on Lefebvre, so I'm not kind of discussing that here. But if you see, in 1981 he writes The Critique of Everyday Life from Modernity to Modernism, and then 1992 Rhythm Analysis. So these are the books that this lecture is based on, and apart from looking at everyday life as the site or as the space that needs to be investigated, he also speaks about the method to analyze everyday life, and that is where rhythm analysis comes in. So how does he define everyday life, and what is everyday life for Lefebvre? For him, everyday life is that space where the abstract forces of, let's say, capitalism, bureaucracy, but also the biological rhythms of our body, our lived realities, all of that come together. So this is the place where it's the level of social existence where all activities, relations and structures converge and are lived as a particular routine which has repetition and familiarity. It kind of feels, when we talk about everyday life, it's the normal. Remember, whenever there is a conflict, the newspapers are quick to announce, once things settle down, that normalcy returns to whatever the place there is. So it's this site for what we consider as normalcy, right? It's the place which is normal, which is routine, which is mundane, which is beyond too much in terms of being spectacular or needs to be observed carefully. This is also the site which we take as natural, but it is not natural. It is not necessarily being lived in the rhythm or in the way that we might naturally live. It is in fact a produced life, and it is historically produced. And at the moment when he is writing, he says capitalism is shaping everyday life in ways that have perhaps been unprecedented before. It is not like usually we would take everyday life as life inside our homes and as something which is private, which is not dictated by the politics of our times, by the mode of production maybe. But he says that's also not the case. He shows us, in fact, how the rhythms in our kitchen, how the bodily rhythms of our waking up, sleeping, how we structure our days, all of that is conditioned and eventually, he says, managed by administrative, capitalist and bureaucratic methods. So he writes in the Critique of Everyday Life, Volume 1, he writes, everyday life is profoundly related to all activities and encompasses them with all their differences and their conflicts. So it is also the site where conflict is absorbed. And what does he mean when he's saying where conflict is absorbed? What he means is that, if you reflect on your life, whenever there is a major historical transformation or even a minor transformation, we all adjust, we accommodate, we kind of make do, we find somewhat alternatives, but then eventually fall into a rhythm and a routine. So, in fact, Lefebvre could go as far as to say that why hasn't a revolution happened despite the alienation that capitalism that has resulted from the capitalist mode of production, and he says it is because in the everyday life this conflict, these contradictions are absorbed. It is their meeting place, their bond, their common ground, and it is in everyday life that the whole of social reality is lived. In some ways, by bringing in everyday life into his understanding of how capitalist society is structured, he is wanting to see capitalism as a totality, as something that is not just in the factory but also at home. Yet everyday life is not perceived as such. It is lived without being conceptualized. It appears as something natural, familiar and self-evident. So just like Marx, when we spoke about Marx, we spoke about fetishism of the commodity. He takes the commodity at the beginning of Das Kapital, and then he shows us how the commodity is this mystical thing that hides beneath it the labor power that has gone into making it, the labor that has gone into making the commodity. Similarly, the everyday appears as so natural, as something that is self-evident, that it conceals the historical processes that have made it, that make it, that continue to make it. He says this is precisely why it must be made the object of critique. For it is here, in this apparent immediacy, that social relations are reproduced, and that alienation penetrates most deeply into existence. So here, in his understanding of alienation, which is why in fact, in some ways you can say his break with the Communist Party, he was expelled from the French Communist Party in 1958. This is the time that he is writing a revised version of the Critique of Everyday Life, Volume 1, with an expanded introduction and preface. And here he is saying that orthodox Marxism is restricting itself to the domain of wage work, but you cannot look at capitalism as a social relation just in the factory floor. You need to kind of move into everyday life and also see alienation in that everyday life. So I'll just read out to remind you what we spoke when we spoke about Marx. Marx writes, "The worker therefore feels himself at home only during his leisure time, whereas at work he feels homeless." Lefebvre would challenge that view. Lefebvre would say that even at home, the worker does not feel connected to himself and therefore feels alienated. I'm going to read out another quote from Volume 1, which is about this alienation pervading all other aspects of our life. He writes, "The worker's life outside his work is also subject to alienation. The relations of production do not disappear once the working day is over. They leave their mark on everyday life as a whole. Housing, leisure, family life, modes of consumption all bear the imprint of the social order. Thus, alienation is not confined to the sphere of labor. It extends to the entire way of life, which is fragmented, repetitive, and deprived of unity, yet lived as normality. Everyday life is therefore not outside history or society, but the very place where their contradictions are endured and absorbed." Once again, think about your life. I mean, you might feel like lazing around in the morning or quietly sitting and having your cup of tea or coffee or whatever it may be, and taking your own sweet time over doing what you want to do. But there is a timetable. You have to get to work at 9, the work finishes at 5, then you have to get back home, you have to do groceries on the way. Even at home, you might be interrupted with phone calls. There is fragmentation. Everyday life is broken up into these routines, these disruptions, these fragmented bits and pieces. Now you're at school, now you're at work, now you're at home, now you are in the mall. And each one appears as disconnected from the other. That's kind of what he's trying to alert us to, kind of show how everyday life under capitalism has become this fragmented that contributes towards the totality but is nevertheless fragmented. In Volume 2, Lefebvre argues that everyday life is no longer indirectly shaped by capitalism. This is, he's moved to the early 1960s, and he's seen post Second World War reconstruction in France with state managed buildings and routines and urban planning and so on. And he says that it is no longer kind of indirectly being controlled or dictated. He says that it is through this regulation, through controlling mechanisms, through laws, through policies, there is repression. It is no longer through a direct domination. Repression here is happening through regulation. And alienation, he says, is happening through integration. So you feel, comfortable going to a mall. Your family time is a time of consumption oftentimes, and so through integration in the capitalist economy, you're getting more and more alienated. So it appears as being socially integrated, but it's actually further fragmentation and further alienation. So let's read again the quote from the second volume, where he writes, actually the quote that I have in the first one is from the second volume. The second one is from another book, which I am not quite covering in this lecture, but I still felt that this quote is important. So let's look at both of them. He writes, individuals are integrated into a system which they do not control, but which provides them with satisfactions that mark their alienation. You might feel very good going to a mall and purchasing your favorite dress of a particular brand, or traveling across the landscape in a new car. But these are also, he says, further alienating processes. Everyday life is profoundly colonized by the commodity, shadowed by inauthenticity, and haunted by the absence of genuine creation. So here he's again nuancing what was Marx's concept of alienation and actually showing how it works in our everyday life, in the mundane, and in that what appears as integration is actually further alienation. But it's not all that the case is not lost. He says, despite all of this managed life, or despite all of this administrative control, these regulations, despite the alienation and the fragmentation, there are moments. There are moments of euphoria, of moments of intense emotion. It could be simply a moment where you somehow get in touch with yourself, where you can, for a brief period of time, escape that totality of structured rhythms, of controlled movements, of tightly fragmented timetables, and then do what comes to you at that moment, which is not predetermined. So in order to discuss moments, I'm going to read out two of his quotes again. A moment is an attempt to achieve the total realization of a possibility. It is not an episode, nor a fragment of time torn from the everyday. It's a form of lived experience which reveals what everyday life conceals. Moments are born of everyday life, but they break with its repetition. So, in the middle of a structured day, you might just stop and pause and actually want to spend a quiet time with your grandmother, or somebody very close to you, which wasn't in the schedule initially, but you made time for it. Those are the moments. There are also other kinds of moments, like for him, the May 1968 revolution was a moment where daily rhythms were broken. The day and night rhythm was also broken. It were very active nights. Students were no longer in the classroom where they were meant to be. They were out there in the streets. So they were breaking notions of prescribed space. They were breaking notions of the timetable. So that was a moment. But then he also tells us that a moment does not last. So he writes, moments cannot be institutionalized. Once fixed, they lose their force and turn into caricatures of themselves. Love, play, festival, creation, each exists as a moment, not as a system. The moment appears, disappears, and may return in another form. Its truth lies not in its duration, but in its intensity. To mistake a moment for a permanent solution is to destroy it. Here, when he's conceptualizing moments, when he's conceptualizing his sense of the rhythms of everyday life, he's also, while he's very much a Marxist scholar, he's also influenced by Nietzsche, he's also influenced by Baudrillard's Poetics of Space, and all of these deeply philosophical ideas where meaning is assigned to actions in everyday life, to moments in everyday life. So in fact, he's coming to Marx from that tradition, which is why he is unwilling to accept a more fixed or deterministic notion of Marxism. In the third volume, he speaks about, you could say, moments, or maybe it's a slightly different idea, but that of the residual, as that which is outside these prescribed rhythms, as that which is not in the timetable, as those little spaces in the time that one can leave out of the structured capitalist time. So in order to explain that, he writes, everyday life is never completely colonized. Well, thank goodness for that. Something always escapes. Residues of the lived, of desire, of body, of play. Body is a very central part in his work, because it is only through the body that we can know. Well, let me finish this reading, and then I want to actually speak about how embodiment is a form of knowledge itself. These residual elements are not exterior to the system, yet they do not submit entirely to it. What persists within everyday life, despite its organization and programming, are residues linked to the body, to rhythms, to affective life, to our emotional life moments. These residues resist total integration, not through conscious opposition, but through the very mode of existence. That is how we are. Our body has its own internal rhythms. They may not be in sync with the rhythms imposed on us, but it does have its own internal moments and rhythms. Residual elements are ambiguous. They may nourish critique, but they may also be reabsorbed. So they are also very fleeting. They do not constitute a revolutionary force in themselves. They merely indicate that everyday life, however managed, is never closed. They may not be the revolutionary force in and of themselves, but they do show us the possibility of life outside the confines of managed time. Now, since everyday life is colonized, since everyday life is structured, even the meanings assigned to that are conditioned by media, by politics, by schools and in other institutions. So then how do we study? How do we study everyday life? Because even if you interpret that meaning, it might have come from elsewhere. It would not be of that domain of everyday life. So one of the ways that he suggests is through observing the rhythms of the body. So for him, the body becomes that site and the method to know everyday life. And he writes, the body serves as a metronome. A metronome is an instrument that musicians use which gives this. Right? So it gives a mechanical rhythm, although the body is not a mechanical rhythm instrument, but it does serve, what he's trying to say is that it does serve as a tool or as a method in order to understand and observe these rhythms. And these rhythms will then tell a story or will help us come to our critique of everyday life. But this metronome is never perfectly regular. It changes tempo, it accelerates, it slows down. It is itself a bundle of rhythms. The body is not only a passive receptor, but also an active measure. It gives access to rhythms by feeling them, by being grasped by them. One must therefore listen to the body, to its internal rhythms and to those imposed from outside. For rhythms are everywhere, in the movements of the street, in work, in rest, in speech, in gestures. To analyze rhythm is to grasp the interaction of time, space and energy in everyday life. I think this really, really nicely summarizes what he wants to get across to us in rhythm analysis. Now I'll take a brief moment to talk about what I have experienced in my fieldwork when I pay attention to my body, and what it experiences. You would have also done so. Time sometimes slows down for us. Time sometimes speeds up for us. When we are waiting for somebody dear, time goes very slow. When we are really having a good time, time passes by very fast. When exam is right around the corner and we have a lot of syllabus to cover, time flies. So during my field work, we were traveling to high altitude areas, and suddenly my sense of the body and that of other people in the team changes. And we have, because of rarefied air, we have headaches, our body feels limp, we almost feel a nausea, you can't walk as fast, you get breathless. So the way we perceive our surroundings changes. Even though you are at work, you cannot really be at work with the speed with which you might be working in the planes. So these are the kinds of things he wants us to pay attention to. What are the rhythms inside your home? You sit and you eat your breakfast, and then someone in the family is getting out to work, somebody else is coming in. Each of these spaces has a particular rhythm that he is encouraging us to see. Lefebvre breaks down time into two kinds, or rhythm in fact, into two kinds. There is the cyclical rhythm, that is the rhythm of the body, and then there is linear rhythms or linear time, that is the rhythm of the capitalist sphere or capitalist mode of production. And he writes, social space is made up of a relatively dense fabric of networks and channels. This fabric is an integral part of the everyday. As for social time, let us emphasize once more the difference between cyclical time scales and linear time scales and their relativeness. We know that the former have their origin in the foundations in nature, or their foundations in nature. They're connected to profound, cosmic and vital rhythms, like the rhythm of the body, like how if you feel like waking up in the morning with the sunrise, you are kind of exhausted and you want to lie down comfortably in your bed at the night. You feel hungry at particular moments. You feel the joy of seeing a loved one at other moments. You smell something nice that creates a different kind of energy in your body. So there is this engagement between time, space, the body, our energy, which is what he's kind of emphasizing for us. We know that the former have their origins in the foundation, or their foundations in nature. I've read that bit. The latter are connected to knowledge, reason and techniques. They correlate not with the vital rhythms and processes, but rather with processes of economic and technological growth. This is the timetable, right? So cyclical time is cosmic, it is bodily, it is natural. You need to go do your morning ablutions in the washroom in the morning. You need to sleep in the night. You do wake up in the morning. It's of the body. It's the menstrual cycle. It is how body feels in different seasons. All of that, day and night, seasons, heartbeats, breathing, but also being born, growing up, adolescence, youth, middle age, old age. All of that are part of the natural bodily processes and rhythms. The phases of life, fatigue, that we get tired, aging, all of that is in the cyclical time. Then there is the linear time, which is the time of capitalism, of bureaucracy, of modern institutions, the school, the hospital, government offices, corporations. These are times that are through the timetable, through work schedules, through deadlines, through administrative calendars. You can have a holiday on Sunday, the rest of the week is a working week. This is the domain of wage work, of shift systems, and of quantified time. This is the time that Marx talks about when he says that the labor power sells his labor power for a particular time to the capitalist, right? It is that time. While cyclical time and rhythms are rhythms of renewal, right? You sleep every night, you wake up every morning, the seasons come and go, the day and night come and go. There is a revival, there is renewal, there is a restoration that happens, and that is how repetitions happen. The repetitions in linear time are more mechanical. They are in the domain of expenditure. You spend time. The idea of spending time, of time as a resource that needs to be managed, this is the domain of linear rhythms. So that's an important distinction that he makes. And then he tells us that it is when these two rhythms are not fitting in with each other, when they're in conflict with each other, when they kind of don't overlap the way that they should maybe, then we have arrhythmia. And arrhythmia is where there is interaction between different rhythms. There is either harmony, or in the contrary, in arrhythmia is the discordance of rhythms. It is revealed through malice, through discomfort, and through suffering. So that's when the tensions, the conflicts, the contradictions show up, which is why it is important to study everyday life, because then you would observe these moments and you would be able to see that what appears normal is not necessarily so, that it is the domain of the managed, that everyday life is a colonized space and time, contrary to what we might think so. Arrhythmia appears when rhythms break apart, when one rhythm imposes itself on others. It is usually, in the capitalist world, linear time imposing itself on cyclical time. Or when rhythms are in conflict, the body then suffers. Illness, fatigue, and unease are the signs of arrhythmia. I'm sorry to end on a somewhat not so exuberant happy note, but we pick on in our next class on Lefebvre with his other books, especially Production of Space. Thank you.